before we get into chapter 1, we're going to deal with this introduction, the first 17 verses in this first lesson. That'll cover a couple of weeks, in fact. But before we go there, we have to have a warning. So most people don't know this, but the book of Romans comes with a warning. And that's found actually in 2 Peter. So if we look at 2 Peter, before we go to Romans for our series on Romans, we're going to go over to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. This is what Peter says. And he's talking about the book of Romans. He says, "And account that the longsuffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul, also according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you." So we have this quotation here is from Romans chapter 2. So Peter is quoting the book of Romans, and then he specifically says, hey, this is what our beloved brother Paul has, according to the wisdom given unto him. So, by the way, if there's any doubt whatsoever that the book of Romans is from God and it counts as scriptures, there's no question. Peter clearly says this is scriptures, this is true. Paul was writing under the inspiration of God. So that's a great introduction. But what comes next gets my attention. "And also in all his epistles, speaking in them of those things in which are some things hard to be understood." So Peter says, hey, Paul's book of Romans, it's sometimes hard to understand. So, hey, don't feel bad if I read through the book of Romans and some of the stuff was confusing. Because the fact of the matter is, Peter, the Apostle Peter, read through the book of Romans and some of the stuff was confusing. So don't feel bad at all, and that's why we're here. We're trying to understand this. Sorry, we're taking it. No problem there. All right, so Peter thought it was and he says this, but listen to what he says here. "Which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing that ye know these things before, beware lest ye also, being led away with the air of the wicked, fall from your own steadfastness." Now this is a sobering warning. I think I ought to pay attention. If Paul is specifically saying, hey, when you read the book of Romans, now he's applying this to all scriptures, as you can see, but his illustration is a quotation from Romans chapter 2. So Peter's saying, hey, you're going through, and he's using that because it has to do with what Peter was talking about in the chapter here. But hey, he's using the book of Romans as his proof text. Peter is. Now Peter has been a Christian a lot longer than Paul. Peter was there with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and we've been talking about this, and we've gone to 2 Peter in our last series. We did how he talked about how we have a more sure word, and that's the scriptures. But now Peter is warning, okay, you can have the scriptures, and you can still fall into error, and here's why. You're unlearned or unstable. Now, check out these words. Unlearned is not saying, okay, you need a PhD in theology. That's not what he's saying here. He's simply saying unlearned as in you're ignorant, as in you don't know something. And if you go to Matthew 22, Jesus, he answered unto these people that should have known everything. These were the experts. These were the Bible scholars. And he said, ye do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God. Now, if the priests and the Levites, the Sadducees running the temple there in Jerusalem, that would be the equivalent of someone with a PhD in theology today. But they err too. So here we have the supposed experts. They were ignorant. But here, Peter the fisherman, he listened to the Bible stories in synagogue every Saturday, and he didn't make the same mistake they made. So it's not a matter of I'm a super smart person or have some deep education. The not falling into the unlearned here is that basically this: you've not read the Bible. We're unaware of the Bible passages that we're talking about. And secondly, it says this, and unstable. Now this word unstable, trying to figure out what does he mean by that? Well, the word is only used 2 times in the Bible, and they're both in 2 Peter. It's used here and a little earlier, but earlier he's specifically talking to people that are easily led astray by false teachers. So we have false teachers, and the people that are easily thrown off by those false teachers, he calls them unstable. The idea is like if this podium here were not constructed well and the boards were falling off and it's about ready to teeter over. So a Christian that's unstable, the opposite, what Paul talks about a lot, is being established in the faith, being grounded in the doctrine of the Bible. So the solution, the cure to not reading Romans and coming up with the wrong idea is to ahead of time know the scriptures, know things, not be unaware of stuff, and then to really be established in what the Bible teaches. Notice that if they're unlearned and unstable, they wrest. Now, wrest means to twist. Like if I wrest something out of your hands, usually use this twisting motion to pull it out. This is kind of an old word that means to twist. And we're talking about twisting the scriptures, bending the scriptures to say something it doesn't. In Peter just absolutely rails on these people teaching false doctrines, and they use Bible to teach false doctrines. And that part of the motivation for this series is there's no passage in the entire scriptures like that as much as the book of Romans has been twisted out of shape. Whether it's the Catholics trying to teach works salvation, or someone trying to say you can lose your salvation over here, or someone trying to teach Calvinism over here, or whatever it is, they take the scriptures and they twist it to say something it never meant to say. And Peter's explaining exactly why it is that they can twist the scriptures out of context. It's because if you're unlearned and unstable, look at this. But he says to them, he's writing to, ye know these things before. So the immunization against going through the book of Romans and being confused is before someone comes and tries to twist it, pull a verse out of context, twist it to mean something it doesn't mean, and convince you to believe something the Bible doesn't teach. If you just go through and know it first. If we can just go through from beginning to end through the book of Romans and understand what it's saying without trying to read something into it, without trying to twist it to our means, without trying to win an argument. There's no argument I'm trying to win here. There's no thing I'm trying to defeat here. We just want to go through and know, what does the scriptures say? And if we're not twisting the scriptures, we won't have this problem. So yes, he's saying, hey, it's hard to understand. But it's only hard to understand if we haven't taken the time to make sure we're stable, we're established in what the Bible teaches, and we're aware of what the Bible says, right? So here's going to be our strategy for avoiding error. These are what I'm going to say are my 4 keys to unlocking Romans. As we go through this series, we're going to do these 4 things. Number 1, Bible references. So when we're going through and reading Romans and it's confusing, I think this is the number 1 reason why people are confused at the book of Romans. Because Romans is referencing things in the Old Testament or elsewhere in scriptures. And if we don't read it as a reference, we get confused. Now, Jesus does this as well. All through the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, you're going to see this. For example, in Matthew 9, this is the one where he actually says it out loud. He says, but go ye and learn what this meaneth. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. For I am not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So it says, hey, go notice this verse has homework. He doesn't just say, hey, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. In fact, it's not him saying, I will have mercy and sacrifice. He's saying, learn what this meaneth. Quote, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. This is a reference. People don't realize this. We have the chapters and verses in our Bible today. But those were written during the Middle Ages. There was the same guy that wrote, but put the chapters and verses in your Bible is the same guy that wrote the Magna Carta. So think King John, he was alive when Robin Hood was still on the earth. That's the time period. Way different than Bible, way later, okay? So there was no Bible verses. There were no chapters. There were no verses, okay? So what did they do? How did they reference something in the Bible? You would just quote a phrase out of it. And so Jesus actually is telling them, I'm going to quote the phrase, but you're not going to understand what I mean unless you look it up in the Bible. And guess what? They don't. So you come back in chapter 12 of Matthew, and he says, but if you had known what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So he gave them homework. They didn't do it. He came back later and says, you're wrong, because if you had listened the first time I told you to look up something in the Bible and you didn't do it, you'd not be in error right here. And so this is a case. These people talking to Matthew, they were wresting the scriptures. They were twisting the scriptures. And he gave them the scripture reference to look it up and get unconfused, but they didn't look at it. This is so key. All the way, there are hundreds of times. I think someone sounded like it was 60 allusions and close to 100 references. There's so many times in the book of Romans where he's referencing something in the Old Testament. And if we don't go look it up, we have no idea what he's talking about, right? So we need to know Bible references. We need to know Bible history. So again, you can't understand what's being said. So if we're reading maybe an account of a battle in the Civil War, but we don't know that. It's just talking about, and I saw him coming up and I pulled out my gun and shot him. And we're thinking, man, this guy must be a murderer that's writing this. Until we realize, oh, wait, he's in a battle. He's defending his country. He's, whatever the case may be. Oh, we're going to think of that so much differently if we know the history of what's going on there. Just out of history, this person does this and it doesn't make doesn't make any sense. If we pull the book of Romans out of its historical setting, we can make it say whatever we want it to say. And we could wrest it and twist it in any which way we want. But guess what? God has given us the exact history. We have the book of Acts, and it's so carefully written that book of Romans is in the middle of the book of Acts. We have the whole story leading up to that when the letter's written, and the whole story after. So we have no excuse for misunderstanding what Paul is saying. But when we forget about what was being talked about at the time and the issues that were coming up in the churches that Paul was preaching to, and then we try to interpret what Paul is saying without knowing that history, we can just make it, we're lost in nonsense, right? Next is Bible words, okay? When we go through, and here's a few issues, obviously. I've got my 1611 printing, right? 400 years ago, the King James Bible was translated. So yeah, some words are a little archaic, but it's not just that. It wasn't just that yes, there's a few words that we don't use, like wrest. We don't use that as much to mean twist anymore. And so I had to take a second to tell you what it meant. So we're definitely going to look up some words we don't understand in the dictionary. But a lot of times it's not just that. When Tyndale translated the Bible into English, there were words that he needed to translate from the Greek, especially the book of Romans, that just were not in the English language. A lot of people don't realize that when the Bible was translated in English, several of these words were invented at that time. So these words, like when you get to atonement or mercy seat or things like that, those weren't English words before the Bible came out into English. So the same problem that translators have today. If you go to some distant tribe in Papua New Guinea, they have no idea what a sheep is. Now, you might be tempted, let's just use an animal they know, but does it make sense to say, behold the pig of God that taketh away? That doesn't make sense at all, right? You're missing a huge point. You're going to get really confused. You have to actually just give them the word sheep. They have no idea what that means, and then you have to teach them what sheep is. And so there was some of that we don't think about it, but that had to take place in the English language as well, where we actually had those words this is a word that, yes, it was maybe common in the Greek language in Paul's day, or common amongst Jewish Christians there, because they knew it from the Old Testament. We have to and so there's going to be some obscure words. Now, of course, Romans especially. If you know Romans versus like John, there's a reason we tell Christians, hey, read through John first, and then read through Romans. John the fisherman, like, he has way less vocabulary. The total, and I remember taking a Greek class in college. They did not have us start with anything that Paul wrote. To start off, anything that John wrote is where you start off with. So you start off with trying to read in Greek anything John wrote, because he has a much simpler vocabulary. So that's just part of it. We got to know what these words mean. And we can't just skip over, I don't know what it means, or it's confusing, or I'm putting some word. But actually, all of that is actually even more minor than the bigger problem. And that is words that we do know what they mean, but then over the years, teachers have heaped extra meaning on top of them. So we're going to get, for example, in Romans chapter 9, we're going to run into this word predestinate. I think you already know where this one's going, but it's a very simple word, a very simple Greek word. But over the years, people have piled a whole bunch of extra meaning on top of it, so that as we're reading, a whole bunch of extra ideas are coming into our head that were never there in the original. And that you can't just solve that by, hey, oh yeah, I know the word, and it doesn't matter if it's an archaic word or not. The issue is that we have twisted the meaning of the word, and therefore it ends up twisting the meaning of the whole verse and the whole passage. How do we fix that? Well, one of the ways is by looking at the scriptures as a whole. We're comparing the word use here versus other places in scriptures. Usually they redefine this to fix this passage, and there's a twisted special definition where we've added to. Well, let's look at all the other places that word is used in the Bible. Does that weird definition in our head fit there? And we realize it doesn't fit here. That doesn't fit here. Wait a minute. I might have added extra to the definition of this word, right? We're going to get that in chapter 1. I think the word saint is the first word we're going to run into like that, where there's a whole weird definition that's been added on to a rather simple word, right? And then finally, Bible context. Now, we're talking about context. Technically, all of this is, in a sense, context. But we can't just pull a phrase out of Romans and read it and understand what it means. You can't. It's part of a long discussion. Everything in the book of Romans is one long logical argument. It goes from one thing to the next thing. Everything built on the previous thing. So if you just pull some phrase out of some part of Romans, you could, again, make it say whatever you want. But does it make sense, having read everything Paul said up to that point and everything he says after that point? Does it make sense? That's why we're going to go through the whole book of Romans. We're not going to try to get bogged down in the weeds too much. If we go too slow, if we spend forever just mulling over one little word here and a word there, we're going to lose the big picture. So we've got to keep the big picture, what is being said. We can't just look at words. We need to look at whole sentences, whole paragraphs, whole chapters, and even more than a chapter, because the chapter breaks weren't there in the original. In fact, there was neither were the spaces or the sentence periods or any of that wasn't there. It just had capital letters, solid. How would you like to read that? So we've got it easy today with these spaces and stuff like that. Now, those things were invented in order to make the Bible easier to read. So it was after the book of Romans was written, so that the book of Romans would be easier to read, we started putting capitalized letters at the start of sentences, spaces between words, periods, and then all of that was invented after in order to make the Bible easier to read. So I'm thankful for that. So we've got it easy today. We've got no excuses. Let me give one example about this whole idea. So look at this. We're not going to understand Romans unless we look at where is it referencing elsewhere in the Bible, the history leading up to that, what the words mean, and making sure we don't have a weird idea of what the words mean. Have they changed meaning? Or have we changed them? Not just changed meaning over time in the English language, but the church that I went to, some teacher I've listened to before, ringing out the scriptures, twisting the scriptures. Has he changed the meaning of the word in my mind? Even though I technically know the right definition, right? And the Bible context. So I'll give this example here, okay? So in modern day, so I pulled up some news articles, right? So this is from Google News or something. Here's some news articles, and they're referencing something you're probably aware of in at least recent political history. That is, they're referencing Joe Biden's cognitive decline. So with something we're aware of at this moment in history, someone watching this video years from now will have completely forgotten about it. But we happen to have a president at this moment that we're not sure if he's actually capable of being the president. So we're not sure who's leading the country. But that's the issue. And so we have all these articles talking about it. And notice they keep using this interesting phrasing. Look at this one here. The emperor's clothes are beautiful. Biden is fit to serve, in quotes. Here, the emperor has no clothes. That's the title. And it's talking about, there's a picture of Joe Biden. The president's deteriorating condition, right? So here's someone else's three strategies. This is a Democrat trying to figure out how to deal with Biden, the emperor who has no clothes. And here is Emperor Biden wears no clothes. Who can stop war with Iran, right? So I think we all know what they're saying here, right? And that's because most of us today are familiar with this children's story, right? Hans Christian Andersen, 180 some years ago, wrote a story, The Emperor's New Clothes, and it was very, very popular, right? He published it along with The Little Mermaid and a few other stories, and they became some of the most loved children's stories for several generations now. And so it's so common a story, kids grow up hearing the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, that this is so common we don't have to say it. Nowhere you read through these, nowhere it'll say, just like Hans Christian Andersen said, in the famous church, they won't. They just straight up go along and they just say, Emperor Biden wears no clothes. Now imagine we jump forward another, now this story was written 187 years ago, but maybe 187 years from now, we forget about this story. Someone else writes some kids and we stop, maybe it's decided to be politically incorrect and they cancel it. Like, what is that storybook I read as a kid? One of the Dr. Seuss books. What is that on to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, right? It's been canceled. You can't buy it anymore. The copyright owners have blocked anyone from printing it. So, who knows? Maybe that's going to happen here. Maybe we're going to cancel Hans Christian Andersen, and and then nobody will know the story. And so imagine they're going back through and reading these articles. So imagine you don't know this story, right? And you come to hear Emperor Biden wears no clothes. How are you going to interpret that, right? Is there any possible? Because there's nowhere in any of these articles does it mention Hans Christian Andersen. It doesn't. But is that a mistake of the authors? Are they wrong to, man, you should have cited your sources? No, this is totally normal. I put 4 articles up here. You see, this is normal, right? This is totally normal, and it's totally correct. It's my fault if I don't know about this book, right? And so if I come here and try to read this, and I'm like, well, I can imagine someone in the future trying to decipher this without any knowledge of this, right? So this gets destroyed in history, and archaeologists are digging up this. And can you imagine them sitting there, the scholars, so smart, and like, oh, we've studied out the deep meanings of these words. We've looked at the root. Now, so the word emperor, it goes back to ancient times, and it means a very powerful leader. Now, even though normally we refer to him as president, but, emperor technically more than when it's the United States, and emperor was controller. So, you know what? The president, maybe that means emperor. Maybe emperor was just another another name for president back then. Maybe that's what it's talking about. They say, wears no clothes. And like, that doesn't make sense because in the picture, he's wearing clothes. So this must have been an allegory. Maybe this allegory is no clothes. Maybe, it's talking about how he buffled through a debate or something. Maybe it's the allegorical of clothes, is like how we put on our demeanor, just like we put on our clothes. And maybe, if you accidentally stumble in what you say in public, maybe the expression was, then you didn't have clothes. So maybe it's just talking about how Emperor Biden, he stumbled in a debate. You see how we're completely wrong? We're utterly wrong. And we can look up the dictionary definitions of emperor, clothes 1,000 times and we'll never get it. Until we go and read this children's book, those words will never make any sense. And I submit to you, the number one reason why people get confused in the book of Romans is until you read the passages it's referencing in the Old Testament, it will make no sense. Here's a really common one from Jesus. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. The Son of Man. I can't tell you how many people have tried, okay, Son of Man, okay, is that talking about his humanity because he was deity? And no, it's not talking about his humanity. You notice when they put him on trial and they were trying to prove that he was claiming to be God, and they had all these false witnesses and stuff like that. They forced Jesus to talk, and he talks, and he just says, ye have said it, and hereafter you shall see the Son of Man. And then he used one additional word, clouds. Son of Man and clouds. And as soon as they heard that, case closed, trial is over. He just claimed to be God. And if you don't get the reference, like how does Son of Man and clouds equal you're claiming to be God? Well, here's the homework for you. Read Daniel chapter 7, and you'll know exactly why. It's 100% a reference. Every time in the New Testament it's saying Son of Man, it's actually really clever because the other time Son of Man is used in the Old Testament is one of the prophets refers to himself as a Son of Man. And up until that moment, it could be taken both ways. He's either calling himself a human teacher or he's calling himself the Messiah, God with man, depending on if he's referring to Daniel chapter 7 or elsewhere. But the second he included the word clouds, that's all it took. 100%, no question about it, Jesus was claiming to be God. That was the strongest statement of Christ's deity anywhere in the scriptures. But it's just like the emperor not wearing clothes. If you don't know the story, if you haven't read, now back in those days, Daniel 7 was huge. It's as popular a passage as John 3:16 is today. You understand? Like back then, because they were under the Roman oppression, and this is the prophecy. Daniel had prophesied that Alexander the Great would come, then he prophesied that Rome would come, and then he prophesied the final prophecy as he saw one like the Son of Man coming out of the clouds and has dominion over. And so this is defeat of the Roman Empire. Like, boy, if you had a passage that talked about the defeat of the Roman Empire and during the Roman days, boy, you would all know it. You would have taught it to your kids. And so everyone knew what he was talking about when he said Son of Man. But sadly, we don't. Why don't we? Well, here's I think the big mistake, and this is where we get way off in the book when it comes to Romans. So much of what Romans is talking about is referencing passages that were popular in Jesus' day. And a lot of those were the key passages that talk about God's chosen people and God's promises to Israel. And here's what we mistakenly do. We read through the Old Testament, and here's a bunch of stuff talking about Zion, the children of Israel, God redeeming his people, and you're like, oh, wait, that's for them there. That's not me. Doesn't apply, and we mentally skip right over it. And now all of the New Testament doesn't make sense to us. We can't skip over it. And it was, in fact, if you read in the scriptures, it wasn't given for them, it was given for us. It was 100% true promises God gave to those people. But that's meant to be an example. God made promises to Israel, and he kept his promises. So now God's making promises to us, and he's going to keep his promises. That's what the whole Bible is. The stuff about the Old Testament, about promises to Zion and David and the children of Israel, is super important. And we, as Christians, New Testament, Gentile Christians, we ought to know it upside down, backwards, forwards. We ought to know it more so than it is sad if a Jewish rabbi knows some promise for the children of Israel in the Old Testament better than a modern day Christian. It ought not to be so. Because the Jewish rabbi today doesn't understand why that promise was given, and we do. We ought to know it. And so that's the thing we miss. Like not knowing this children's story makes these articles make no sense. Not knowing the stories of the Old Testament make the Bible make no sense. And look at this. There's another reason why we wouldn't apply. Let's say you do know this. There's another way in which we not make the connection. What if slowly over time we redefine these words? What if we started referring to our president as emperor? You see what I'm saying? What if 20 years from now, the president declares himself the emperor and we start using that word, right? And then what if we actually do start using the word someone's not wearing clothes to refer to something completely different, like has a bad hairdo, right? So in the future, imagine 50 years from now, we may still know about this book, but in fact, to the point, we've redefined those words to where we start reading this book and misunderstanding this book. That's what happens a lot with the Bible as well. Over time, we add theological definitions to words, and we redefine the words since the Bible was written, to where even though we may know the story, and we see this here, we don't make the connection because we're making the connection to something else. It's someone else. In this case, false teachers wringing the scriptures, twisting the scriptures. They're bending the scriptures, and we let that influence us. Pretty soon, even though the connection should be obvious, we don't see it. It's the same problem. This is my thesis here. We're going to go through the book of Romans, and this is how we're not going to get wrong. Right? But we're going to start with a story. Again, we can't even probably won't be next week until we really dig into the first chapter. But I want to start with the story because knowing the backstory is important. We need to know the history. So give me a moment here just to tell the story of the book of Romans. I have all the references there in your notes. So you can go through the references and see where I'm getting this stuff. But rather than digging through each verse bit by bit, I'm just going to tell the story, all right? So the story starts in the winter of 56. Not the winter of 1956, but just the winter of AD 56. And here in this house, in the city of Corinth, there's a Jewish rabbi talking to a Greek scribe. This is a strange thing. Again, to us, it doesn't seem strange, but the strangeness of a Jewish rabbi being in a Greek person's house is bizarre. That just wasn't done back then. That was against the rules, if you will. And the fact that he's talking to him and conversing with him, this is such a strange moment. What had happened? So here we are in Corinth, Greece, right? And Paul, this Jewish rabbi turned Christian, which again, back then, he was still considered a Jewish rabbi because Christianity at that moment was a sect of Judaism. So again, make sure we understand what we're saying here. He 100% was still a Jew. He 100% was still a Pharisee. He was 100% still a rabbi, a teacher. But he was teaching what the true gospel, what the true teaching of the Old Testament was. And he had gone through here's what we call Asia back then. Now we have a continent, but this is modern-day Turkey and modern-day Greece. And he had just completed 3 missionary journeys. And he was at the end of his 3rd missionary journey, and he'd come back through he started churches, and he stopped off in Corinth with the plan of, I want to continue on to Jerusalem, but you can't travel through the sea in the winter. So for 3 months, he stays here, there in the city of Corinth. An important city, one of the most important cities in one of the most important civilizations in history. So this is not some backwards town. It was an important port. And he abode there. It's 3 months he's staying there. And there in Corinth, he's staying in the house of one Gaius, right? And so this is probably a wealthy person. He owns a house, enough space, he's being hospitable. Now, if you were to put yourself back into that house, he's sitting there, and there's a huge stack of money over here. It's being stacked up, and someone's sitting there counting it. And I was like, is Paul about getting rich? No, he's not going to keep 1 cent of that. He's just gone around to all of these churches and collected money. He's heading back to Jerusalem. The people in Jerusalem were being persecuted, and a lot of them, the Christians there, had lost their property, and so they'd collected money to give to help the poor Christians in Jerusalem. He was excited about that. He wrote about that in previous letters he had written to Corinth. He had already written them 2 letters to correct a lot of things they were off doctrinally, and now he was there in person for 3 months helping them out, and he had collected this money, and he was about to head back to Jerusalem once the weather cleared up. But he had something in his heart. Pacing back and forth in the room, he had something much bigger than just Greece and modern-day Turkey, if you will. The center of the world at that time was Italy, was Rome. The city of Rome was the biggest and most powerful city in the world, and he had this heart. You know what? He had gone to other Gentile cities, but he had never been to Rome. Now, part of that is that the emperor had kicked the Jews out of Rome, so he wasn't legally allowed to go there. Maybe he could because he was a Roman citizen, but most of the Jews were kicked out of Rome, and he had a lot of reason to not go there because he was first going to places where the gospel hadn't been preached. And evidently, early on, probably after the day of Pentecost, a church had started there in Rome. And Christians were multiplying, people were getting saved, and it was excited about it. But he knew, although he had reached this area, there was still so much more to reach with the gospel. And boy, he dreamed of maybe I could go to Rome myself and preach there. I mean, he's seen how many people were saved in these little backwater towns over here. Imagine how many people would be saved if he preached in the city of Rome, how encouraged that church would be. But he had bigger sights than that, because no one had brought the gospel to Spain yet. So his plan wasn't just to go to Rome. His plan was after he had gone to Rome to use that as a launching pad for a new missionary journey to Spain and preach the gospel where it never been preached before. And he was so excited. But first, he was going to go to Jerusalem and get some funds there to the people in Jerusalem, the poor Christians there. He'd already promised he would do that, so he was going to do that first before he launched into his new and exciting missionary endeavor. Then a knock came at the door. And then walked a godly Christian, someone he knew had the gift of prophecy, not some kind of fake gift of prophecy, but actually God spoke to him. This is before they had much of the scriptures, and many churches had someone that could foretell the future. And in came this man, and Paul saw the look on his face, and he already knew what he was going to say. Because in every town Paul had gone to on that journey up to this point, there had been someone in that church who God had spoken to and warning Paul, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be put in bondage. You're going to be put in prison. And so, sure enough, this man talks to Paul. Hey, Paul, I had a dream last night. You were going to Jerusalem, and there they got you, and they threw you in prison. Oh, don't go. Bonds and afflictions, it abides you there. Now, right or wrong, Paul was convinced he needed to go anyway. But imagine at this moment, he started to think, wait a minute. Am I ever going to get to speak in Rome? If I'm put in prison in Jerusalem, he knew exactly how it worked. He used to be doing that sort of thing. He's going to be stoned to death. Remember, he killed Stephen. I mean, Saul knew exactly how this worked. I might die the martyr's death, and he was okay with that. He was ready to die for the cause of Christ. But man, he's the apostle to the Gentiles. I'll never get to go to Rome. I mean, wouldn't it be sad? Here's the biggest Gentile city, and the apostle to the Gentiles never. And he had learned so much stuff from these little towns all around. Issues that he knew would come up in the church of Rome. And he had been so excited about teaching them this stuff, because it's the same stuff he had preached everywhere else. He had never been to Rome yet, and now he may never get to. Just then another knock at the door. And then comes a widow woman named Phoebe. And Phoebe walks in and says, hey, now that the Jews are allowed to go back to Rome, I wanted to go back home to Rome. And do you think the church there would accept me? Oh, I think they would. But Phoebe was being supported. She was serving and working in the church full time. She was being supported by the church here. And so she had no means of getting income on her own, just a single lady. So if I go to the church at Rome, they don't know me. They don't know if I'm just a grifter or if I'm actually a hardworking servant. They're not going to pay. Oh, Paul said, I know. I'll write you a commendation letter. Wait, letter? That's it. Hey, when you head back to Rome, could you carry a letter for me? I haven't had a chance to talk to the people at Rome, and I may never get to. I may die here in a few months. But I could just pour out all the things I've learned in all these other cities. And if I put it down in a letter, and Phoebe, if you deliver it to Rome, then even if I die, I will have had a chance to get these powerful truths to the Christians there at that really big church that's been growing in Rome. So he sits down. Hey, Tertius. Tertius is his scribe. Grab out a piece of paper, grab out a pen. And he began to write. As Paul dictates and pours out his heart, all the issues that have been coming up in all those little churches. We know what those are. We can find them in the book of Acts. We can see them in Galatians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We know in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We know what the issues are. So he's not going to sit there and complain about the issues. He's just going to give the positive truth. This can confuse us, because as he's writing, he's not saying, hey, so-and-so is teaching this false doctrine, so-and-so is... No, he doesn't. I just want to be positive. Tertius, I'm just going to walk through and teach them the truth that I know will counter every one of the lies that I know. In fact, you know what? Now that Nero is on the throne, Jews are coming back to Jerusalem, to Rome. You know what? The Jews coming back to Rome, they're going to teach the same weird teachings that they've been teaching everywhere else. I better get ahead of this thing. And he starts to pour out his heart, systematically going through the gospel. Every accusation, every complaint. Essentially what he writes is the frequently asked questions section of the Christian faith. These are basically the things that Paul had run into time and time again. These are the frequent objections, and he's going to systematically go through them. And he pours out his heart, and he gets to what we now know as Romans chapter 8, and he starts pouring out his heart about how even if he's martyred, and he would think, okay, yeah, Paul, I know why you're saying that, because you think, but why am I saying it to the Romans? Why are we talking about martyrdom? Why are we talking about being more than conquerors? How could he know at that moment that in a few years, Rome would be burnt to the ground, and Emperor Nero would blame this very church, and the very Christians he's writing to, most of them would die, tied to burning stakes, torn apart by lions. How could he know that this is what would happen to the Roman church? But he wrote a letter, and it got into their hearts. So they stood with boldness, and the world was amazed. The spectacle was unstoppable. These Christians, having read those words, being so established in the faith, were willing to look death in the eyes. They smiled as flames devoured their bodies. They stood with boldness as they were eaten by lions. The very people he wrote the book of Romans to turned the world upside down. So I can't imagine how amazing that moment was. The spring came. Paul goes down to Paul's going to get on a ship and head to Jerusalem. Phoebe's going to get on the ship carrying this scroll headed to Rome. But of course, already they heard, hey, down at the docks, there's people waiting for you. They're going to murder you, Paul. So Paul's like, I've got to walk by land up to Macedonia and go the long way around, right? Oh. But nobody's going to stop Phoebe. So they sit there trying to block Paul from speaking to the Gentiles. And they're sitting there, right? We can't let him get the truth to the Gentiles. We don't want that. And so the Jewish assassins are sitting there. If we see Paul, we'll jump out and kill him. And along comes Phoebe. And they don't pay her any mind. And they have no idea that she's holding the very thing they're trying to stop. She walks past and gets on that ship and heads for Rome. It's too late. They've already failed. Paul then gets to Jerusalem, and they, this is this guy, that guy that's turned the world upside down, and they're attacking him and says, this is terrible. And he stands up and he begins to speak about his story, about how God called him, until he gets to one critical juncture. He gets to the point where he says, and God tells him, I will send thee hence far unto the Gentiles, those that weren't Jews. When that word comes out of his mouth, they immediately erupt. When they hear the word, you are preaching the truth to the Gentiles, immediately they stand, away with this fellow from the earth, for it is not fit that he should live. They cast off their clothes, they threw dust in the air, kill him right now. If we kill him right now, the Gentiles will never hear this. But they were too late. They were too late. He wasn't ashamed of the gospel of Christ. He had already gotten to the Jew first, but also to the Greek. Phoebe was already there in Rome by then. They were too late. The gospel went to the whole world. And that letter turned the world upside down. The change, the impact it had but we can't take it away from that historical context. As we come back next week, we're going to dive into the introduction and how Paul starts and his heart for the people at Rome. But I want you to keep in mind where we're going, where this came from, this story. Again, you can go through all the verses there in the notes of the whole story of Phoebe and where I got all that. But Tertius writes down this letter, hands it to this widow, and they change the world. And all the attacks that come against Paul for the daring to preach the gospel also to the Greek, oh no, horrendous. But it can't be stopped because it's already been done. It's already been written down. Even if they could kill him that day, the gospel can't be stopped. Right, so we'll stop there and we'll continue next week as we really dig into the book of Romans. And I think as we go through some of this, hopefully it'll come alive and be simple and easy to understand and hopefully a lot of fun as well. Right.